Let's talk a little bit about iodine toxicity, because I was talking about some people questioning whether or not iodine is safe if you have an autoimmune thyroid problem. This is probably one of the most common questions that I get asked, and the answer is yes. Iodine is safe, but it's a dose issue. You can go way too high with iodine. Is there a toxicity level that we could reach with iodine? And the answer is there's a toxicity level to everything, but there's not a lot of research on iodine toxicity. There are acute iodine toxicities, and if you generally speaking, to get acute iodine toxicity, you've got to be taking grams a day. We're not talking about the stuff that's in your typical supplements. So acute toxicity of iodine is generally going to manifest as burning the mouth, burning of the throat, burning in the stomach. These are all things that can happen. So we'll just put burning up here. People can develop fever, cyanosis. The skin can turn a bluish discoloration. Again, iodine is purple in color, and it's a pigment. It can pigment. If you've ever seen, in a surgery room where they rub that iodine gel on the skin to prep people for surgery, because iodine is a natural antibacterial, so it helps to prevent infection. But that stuff can absorb into you, and it does dye you. So the cyanosis of the skin, that you got to be really, really high levels to get to that. And then as well, like vomiting or nausea, because you've ingested such a high quantity, just too much at one time. Again, that's an acute toxicity. But as far as chronic toxicity, there's no great research showing that chronic toxicities exist. As a matter of fact, I mentioned earlier that some cultures in Japan eat the level of iodine, anywhere from 50 to 80 milligrams a day or more of iodine, with no signs or symptoms of toxicity or hyperthyroidism as a result or as a cause of that consumption. So it's a case-by-case basis. If you have an autoimmune thyroid disease, you should not be scared of taking iodine, but you also just shouldn't take a ton of megadose iodine without actually testing your levels. So let's talk next about iodine testing. We're running out of room here. Now we can put it right here. So testing, how do you know whether or not you have an iodine deficiency? Now, I've seen some people come in to see me and they had some plasma iodine levels done. You can test it in the blood, but it's not a very accurate assessment or in a very accurate way to actually identify whether or not a person has a need for iodine. So blood is we'll put question mark by it. It can be tested, but blood plasma, but not recommended, not the kind of gold standard. Okay. Some people actually do a skin test where you put a solution of iodine on the skin, and then if it absorbs quick enough, then they call that an iodine deficiency. Although this, it can be marginally helpful, it's not something I would recommend that you do long-term iodine supplementation based on. And then the last, and in my opinion, the most important is the loading test. It's called an iodine loading test. Now, one of the things that I like to do when I'm running an iodine loading test is I like to look at all the halides together. And that way you don't just get an idea for iodine and how much iodine is or isn't there, but you also get an idea for whether or not this person is being exposed to things that would contribute to interference with the uptake of iodine into the thyroid gland itself. So a loading test is generally done. This is a urine test. And it's generally done by taking a first morning sample of urine followed by a 50 milligram dose of iodine iodide, and then a collection of urine over the next 24 hours. And what's being looked at there is how much of the 50 milligrams of iodine, because 50 milligrams is a really strong dose, how much of that came out in the urine over a 24-hour period. An average person with adequate iodine is going to excrete 80 to 90% of that 50 milligrams out into the urine, and that would indicate decent saturation of iodine in their tissues. So it's a much better indicator for whether or not a person is tissue saturated with iodine, and it's a functional outcomes-based parameter type test, which makes it more effective and more accurate when you're trying to ascertain whether or not you should be taking higher doses of iodine especially over long periods of time. It's not something I recommend people do without having adequate testing, at least not higher doses. So that brings us to the next one, which is kind of what are the doses? What are the doses of iodine if we're looking at how much to take? You know, it's recommended that about 200 micrograms a day for an average person is what's necessary to prevent iodine-induced disease. Again, you got to remember that these smaller numbers are so that you make sure there's not a frank, overt hypothyroidism goiter happening. But there are, with deficiencies, there's kind of what we look at as the recommended daily allowance or the recommended daily intake versus the optimal level versus suboptimal versus subclinical disease. Like there's a kind of a category or a range of levels. And so 200 micrograms is just a recommended daily amount to avoid frank overt disease. So this number, it might be higher for some than that. It might be higher for some. And so 200 micrograms is kind of just a baseline to think about. So a good multivitamin is going to contain adequate quantities of iron in that way. Again, part of why I formulated Ultra Nutrients with iodine was to make sure that if you weren't using salt and you were avoiding that processed food and that processed salt, and you didn't like seafood, because I don't like seafood, not very much anyway, that you could get adequate iodine without having to worry about using highly chemically washed table salt as part of your regular diet. Now, therapeutically, how much iodine? So there's a much bigger range of therapeutic levels of iodine. And so that ranges for most anywhere between 5 and really up to 50 milligrams a day. Now, I don't recommend that anybody go into that high level 50, even really 25 milligrams or higher without really having your level tested, because if you haven't had your level tested, you may not need that much. And again, it's not that iodine is dangerous to supplement with. However, you don't want to, one of the things with iodine, one of the reasons why I don't like to see people supplement, especially if they have a thyroid problem, is because taking higher levels, like 25 milligrams of iodine or higher, can actually falsely elevate your TSH. And so what happens is you're taking iodine and your TSH shoots up. Normal TSH is going to be, depending on the lab, it's going to be anywhere from like 0.2 to 4.5. Like that's the normal range for TSH. But when you take iodine in higher doses, I've seen cases where it'll drive it up over 25. And so if you're driving up your TSH over 25 and you end up in your doctor's office and he's measuring your TSH or she's measuring your TSH and you're at 25, they're going to freak out and try to put you on mega doses of thyroid hormone. So again, not a good idea to just, take it surreptitiously in high mega doses without having adequate testing done. But relatively safe at, if you keep it 12.5 milligrams or less, if you're doing this on your own without the oversight of a doctor, that's relatively safe. But again, I wouldn't do it longer than a year if you're not getting tested, but relatively safe. So that's kind of your issue on the doses. Hey, don't forget to check out the rest of the series right here. Make sure you hit subscribe below. And as always, thanks for tuning in.